Good evening. On behalf of community advocates and Jews United for Democracy and Justice and our executive board of Mel Levine, Zev Yaroslavsky, Des Kamenereznik, Ken Chasen, and Caroline Kelly, I welcome you this evening. Our growing list of co-sponsoring organizations includes the founding partners, Jews United and Community Advocates, now joined by ICAR, the Jewish Center for Justice, Leo Beck Temple, Stephen Weiss Temple, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Valley Beth Shalom, Temple Beth Am, Temple Isaiah, the LA Museum of the Holocaust, the Pico Union Project, the Jewish Collaborative Orange County, the American Jewish Committee Los Angeles, and Congregation Shirat Hayam of Nantucket, Massachusetts. The next few Wednesdays offer a continuing lineup of very impressive and illuminating speakers and the very best and award-winning moderators. To help you plan your Wednesday night, here's a quick rundown of whom we have secured. Next week, former ambassador to Russia Mike McFall, a professor at Stanford and a fellow at Hoover Institution, will dialogue with another Russia expert and frequent guest on these town halls, Max Boot, a weekly columnist at the Washington Post. The subject, can Biden repair the damage done to U.S. foreign policy? The following week, we will have a follow-up to tonight's discussion. It's entitled Combating Domestic Violent Extremists and the Challenges Involved. It will feature Rand's terrorism maven, Brian Jenkins, one of the patriarchs of terrorism studies, together with Javed Ali, formerly on the National Security Council counterterrorism desk. They will explore why domestic terror may be more challenging for law enforcement than foreign jihadis. They'll be interviewed by KBC's Larry Mantle. In subsequent weeks, we'll have CNN's Wolf Blitzer, the New York Times' David Brooks, and CNN host and Washington Post columnist Fareed Zakaria. It should be an exciting couple of months. We hope you'll join us each week at this time. It's now my pleasure to return the program to my colleague and friend of over 45 years, a human dynamo, Janice Kamener-Resnick.
Thanks, David. Before I introduce our panel, this week on Thursday night and Friday, we celebrate Purim. For those unfamiliar with the holiday, I provided some links in this week's emails. In short, Purim is a celebration of the courage and bravery of upstanders, of those who did not stand idly by in the face of evil. So tonight's program is an homage to Purim's protagonists, Esther and Mordechai, who stood up to the domestic terrorists of their day. Tonight we have an amazing panel to talk about a critical issue. As such, I am going to keep these introductions very brief so as to maximize the time for our panelists to share their thoughts and ideas. I'm sure I will not do any of them justice because they're three amazing women and a great facilitator. Attorney Roberta Kaplan is an extraordinarily accomplished lawyer, having argued before the U.S. Supreme Court numerous times, most notably the case of U.S. v. Windsor, which required the federal government to recognize same-sex marriages. In partnership with Integrity First for America, Roberta is lead counsel representing plaintiffs in their case against 24 white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and hate groups for the violent 2017 events in Charlottesville. Roberta is a graduate of Harvard and received her JD from Columbia School of Law, where she also teaches. Joanna Mendelson is Associate Director of ADL, that's the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism, which combats extremism, terrorism, and all forms of hate. Ms. Mendelson has been with the ADL for 2 decades and is a certified subject matter expert on domestic terrorism. She has helped the FBI identify hundreds of extremists, including some involved in the January 6th insurrection, and has provided testimony in numerous cases. Joanna has trained more than 12,000 federal, state, and local law enforcement officers, judges, and public officials nationwide on extremism and domestic terror. She is a graduate of Emory University with a degree in conflict resolution. Special Agent in Charge Voviette Morgan has been with the FBI for 25 years. She recently assumed the position of Special Agent in Charge of the Intelligence Division at FBI Los Angeles, where she is responsible for driving the complete integration of intelligence and operations. In her years with the FBI, SAC Morgan was head of the LA FBI's criminal division, criminal division. She was head of the LA FBI's criminal division. Special Agent Morgan earned her BA in legal studies from UC Berkeley and then her MA in public administration and public policy at USC. And we're very glad she was not seriously injured in a biking accident yesterday. You'll see a little evidence of her calamity, but we really appreciate her being with us tonight. And to facilitate our conversation, we welcome back the incomparable Patt Morrison, a longtime Los Angeles Times writer, columnist, and podcaster who has a share of 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Her broadcasting work has won her 6 Emmys and 12 Golden Mike Awards. So she certainly will do a great job with this amazing panel of experts. Now I'll turn the program over to Pat, and thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, Janice, and thank you to David too. And we're going, of course, to have, as usual, a question and answer period at the end of our session. So you can be thinking about the questions you would like to ask and put them in the Q&A box, and then we'll be able to pick and choose among them the ones that we think are most pertinent and most salient, and the ones that, well, that really convey the sense of what it is you'd like to know from our guests. So thank you to all of you for joining us. Before his hearings in the Senate for Attorney General, Merrick Garland said this: "There is a line from Oklahoma City forward to January 6th, and there is another line from Oklahoma City all the way back to Reconstruction and Ku Klux Klan crimes against the newly freed slaves." So what we're talking about is not new in this country. It's very old, it has deep roots, but we're seeing perhaps new manifestations for reasons that we're going to find out tonight. We talk about who these people have been over the decades: Gordon Call, the violent tax protesters, Sovereign Citizen, Posse Comitatus, the survivalists in northern Idaho. And why is this something new and different, or does it just spring from very old roots? So let me start first with Roberta Kaplan on that point, and give us a sense of, Roberta, where you think, as you're prosecuting these cases that emerged out of January 6th, is this something very old or very new, or a combination?
So let me answer your question, but first I have to correct one thing that was said in the very lovely introduction. I've argued in many, many courts throughout the country. I've only argued at the Supreme Court once. So it would not be accurate to say that I've argued numerous times at the Supreme Court.
You only have one feather then, one white feather.
Only one feather, and one fancy pen, exactly. Look, I think the most honest answer to the question, of course, is both. We absolutely have had these roots in our country from its very origins, from slavery on. And much of the Department of Justice that Merrick Garland will now lead was created, frankly, in Reconstruction in order to deal with the incredible problems that our country was facing with resistance to the idea that African Americans would now have equal rights, rights to vote, rights to be full citizens under the law. And there was a growing movement, most symbolized by the Ku Klux Klan, that wanted to effectively re-enslave the newly freed African Americans in the 1860s, 1870s onward. And Congress, in its wisdom, passed a number of laws. Ironically, the one that's being used both in my case about Charlottesville and in many of in the big case by Benny Thompson involving what happened on January 6th, called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. It's pretty ironic and sad and tragic all at once that here today in 2021, we have to go back to a statute that old, back from 1871, in order to vindicate what should be basic principles in our country, and that is that people are not entitled to engage in conspiracies to stop officials from performing their duties or to engage in racialized violence. I think over time in our country, there have been stages where it's gotten, I think hatred has always been there. I'm maybe because of what my job is, I'm too much of a cynic to believe that hatred has ever been eradicated, or maybe that it can ever be eradicated. But there have been times in our country where the people who hate, and let me be very clear with this audience, Jews are, if not the top of the groups they hate, at the top of the groups they hate, certainly today. But when people who have these horrible racist anti-Semitic hatreds have felt emboldened, not to just hang out or not to just, as the KKK had to do, to meet in the forest in Mississippi or Alabama wearing white hoods, but to come out, to protest on the streets, to commit an insurrection at the Capitol, to commit violence and even murder in Charlottesville. And a lot of about our society has allowed that to happen. A huge piece of it is what we're on today, which is social media and tech. Because today, you don't need to wear a white hood. All you need to have is a hashtag. And there are sites all over the internet that will accept you and welcome you. And many of these men, most of them are men, were people who several years ago, may have been playing video games kind of obsessively in their parents' basements. And for a number of reasons, feel now emboldened to come out on the streets and actually act out their horrible ideologies and hatreds and frankly fantasies.
Okay.
And that's what we're seeing. And I think our goal has to be, frankly, to send them back to their parents' basements. We can't get rid of the hatred, but we can get rid of this open insurrection and open violence on the streets of American cities.
So Voviette, from the point of view of the FBI, is this a continuum? Does that help the FBI in its work to understand who people are who are extremists and white supremacists?
I mean, I think, look,
Excuse me, Roberta, I'm sorry, that was for Voviette.
Oh, good, that makes much more sense because she would know a lot more about this.
No, well, Roberta, I think you set the stage and gave a very good, if you will, kind of platform for us to build upon and to develop, because I think everything you said is spot on. And what I will say, just to piggyback a little bit, when you talk about providing a little bit of a history lesson, one of the reasons we're living and experiencing the things that we are dealing with right now is simply because we haven't dealt with it properly over the years. That ugly R word, racism, anti-Semitism, we haven't dealt with these issues. And so here we are in the 21st century and in year 2021, still tackling these issues that have been with us for a very extended amount of time. And what has happened and what has, in my opinion, and I think for us in the FBI, what has become a little bit more different as we look at the events of January 6th is the violent nature that has occurred. This has become extremely violent and it's become mainstream. A lot of things used to stay, if you will, in their nasty little areas of the communities and went a little bit unspoken, but very well known. But now we're at a point where there is a level of legitimacy that has been provided to these groups where they have come to the forefront and they are not shy about espousing their hate. And, for us in the FBI, because we take it very seriously to protect people's civil rights and to protect people's First Amendment rights, where people have a right to say, as unpleasing as it may be, there might be a lot of hate speech out there, but when it goes to that violent nature and when it crosses that line, that's where we have to hold people accountable. And that's where law enforcement has to respond and we have to react.
So Voviette, to follow up very quickly before I go to Joanna, where is that legitimacy coming from? Because every 4 years we may have a change of administration and a change of philosophy about whether or not we should bother prosecuting and looking into people like this.
Well, I think that legitimacy has come from leadership. I think the leadership has allowed a certain level of legitimacy or lent a certain level of legitimacy to these issues and to these groups. And I will tell you, this is something we're all grappling with. I'd like to hear from the other panelists too of their thoughts, because I think we're still trying to figure it out. But I think that is one element of where it has come from is leadership, people that do have loud voices and people that are legitimate power brokers within society have brought it to the forefront, therefore creating, I think, that moral legitimacy for people to be very public in expressing their extremism.
Joanna, we just heard from a Wisconsin senator in Senate hearings about his sense that, well, no, these were not, the violent people were not our people, were not the people we suspect. And I'm going to ask Roberta about that later. But we've become so familiar with hate crimes and the annual reporting of hate crimes, but now we see these groups in a way converging. There's almost a unified field theory. So I'd like you to speak to this new threat, kind of a force multiplier that we have seen from all the factors we've just been talking about.
Absolutely. So essentially, we've really seen, as a result of January 6th, this new breed of extremism that has emerged. And they are part of this entire ecosphere of disinformation, of lies, of conspiracy theories. And it's fertilized by extremist thought leaders and as well as the highest levels of our government. And so what I find most dangerous and what was most disheartening from this week's hearing is the fixation and really the flat out denial that runs rampant about the true culpability of those involved in the insurrection. Because at the core, if you can't acknowledge the threat, if you can't identify the threat, you can't bring the tools to bear in order to respond to the threat. And so when we see individuals doubling down on the notion that this is the work of Antifa, that they were provocateurs, they're fake Trump protesters, and quote, not run-of-the-mill Trump supporters, this is a willful negation of reality. And I think at the end of the day, we expect our leaders in order to call it out. And I think going off of Voviette's point, when we don't have our leaders use their bully pulpits and speak immediately, directly and vociferously to address hate and call it out, what happens is that it allows hate to fester. It allows extremists to be more emboldened. And what we've seen in the last few years is this acceptance, this feeling that I can take off my virtual mask. I can march in the streets, whether or not it's at Charlottesville or at the Capitol, and I can share my views that are full of disinformation and hate in many ways. But I also want to add, this hate is about the other. If you break it down, it's about othering others. And so time and time again, we see that the hate that we saw historically is the same hate from today. It's the same tenets, it's the same macro and micro conspiracies and beliefs, but they're just retooling it. They're weaponizing hate. They're using technology to augment their message and to bring it to a global audience. And this is what distinguishes and perhaps makes it even more pernicious today than before, because of the ability to essentially broadcast these messages to a global audience.
Roberta, what have, in line with what it is that Joanna was saying, what have you, in the case you're handling now with the 24 white supremacist and extremist defendants, what have you discovered that's new about how they operate, how they think, and what we were just alluding to? Usually you think of sunshine as a disinfectant. Now sunshine seems to make it grow instead of shrink. You're still muted, Roberta.
Let me begin with what's old about what they said, and picking up with both Joanna and Voviette said, is that there's a lot of what happened in Charlottesville and a lot of their ideologies that are very old. Deborah Lipstadt is going to testify as an expert in our case at trial in October, and she will testify that many of the motifs, many of the slogans, many of the things they shouted on the streets of Charlottesville were copied directly from Nazi ideology in the 30s. And she has said the same thing about the flags that were being carried at the Capitol on January 6th. So much of this is extremely old, going all the way back to medieval European history. On the other hand, I think two things are new. The biggest thing is what Joanna and Voviette have said, which is the capacity of the internet. What the internet has done is given isolated groups all over the country, who in the past would have had to have met in the forest wearing white hoods, the ability to talk to each other, not only all over the United States and to plan, not only all over the United States, but all over the world. So, for example, the person who shot up the church in New Zealand, Christchurch in New Zealand, on his gun had something called a fashtag. That's fascist plus hashtag. I'm not even going to try to explain the mentality of these people. And that hashtag was invented by Matthew Heimbach, who's one of the defendants in the Charlottesville case. Similarly, there was communication between the man who shot up the church the synagogue, Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, with many of the defendants in our case. And even on January 6th, while many of the defendants in our case did not go, thank God, because they were too scared about our case, so it's had some impact, and so they did not show up in person, their groups and groups associated with their groups, like the Proud Boys, were there, as everyone knows, in flying colors and very much involved in the violence. I'm just going to be blunt about it. The one other thing that is new, which again we've heard, is the willingness of leaders in our country to encourage them. And I'm going to be blunt. The primary person who bears responsibility for this is Donald Trump. When Donald Trump said after Charlottesville, there are very fine people on both sides, every white nationalist and every racist in the United States of America saw that, rightly so, as him cheering them on. When he said at the debate, the presidential debate, that the Proud Boys should stand by, the Proud Boys saw that, again, rightly so, as encouragement to continue what they were doing and to continue organizing and to continue threatening violence. And of course, the statements he said leading up to January 6th were the apotheosis of encouraging these people, telling them that they are now on the verge of power of this country. And those words, we know in Judaism from studying the rabbis, that words have power. Words, while we have a First Amendment in our country, words can often have more power than action. And what we've seen here is words from our leaders telling these people that they're not only that their beliefs are okay, that their beliefs are mainstream, and that if they go and act on their beliefs through acts of violence, they will be cheered, encouraged, and protected. That's what's changed.
Voviette, apropos of that, after the attacks of 2001, we created the Patriot Act, which gave tremendous powers to and reorganized a lot of our intelligence and law enforcement services. But with domestic terrorism groups, you can explain the other set of rules that we have to play by. I'm sure there's civil liberties concerns, and every administration, you get a sense of, well, it's time to talk about domestic terrorism, especially after Oklahoma City, for example. But it just didn't seem to come together. So what's the playbook for the FBI in dealing with it?
Well, the playbook continues to change and unfold, but when you talk about from a legal perspective, and I'm glad Roberta is here, I'm not an attorney, I just play one sometimes on a daily basis, but the reality of it is we don't have domestic terrorism statutes. There are no domestic terrorism laws on the books. When we do move forward as we investigate and then charge matters that are pertaining to domestic terrorism, they are primarily, human rights. They are civil rights charges and things along those lines. We don't have domestic terrorism laws or statutes. And I'm not saying that we necessarily need them, but because for us, again, as I alluded to earlier, the domestic terrorism piece, it really crosses the line when it becomes an act of violence. When violent criminal activity occurs is when law enforcement, the FBI in particular, is going to engage. But I do think it is important to maybe strengthen some of those laws that we currently already have that currently exist. But for us, the real playbook for us is we need people that are listening on this call today, and why it was so important to me to be a part of this call, even in my little bicycle accident where, yes, the vanity in me wanted to pass and not be a part of this, but it was so important. And the reason I am here is always to solicit the support of the community, to solicit the support of our local communities across the country to engage with us, because again, everyone knows their community better than any law enforcement officer or agency ever will. And it goes back to that simple term that we use and that simple saying from the events of 9/11, if you see something, say something. If you notice that people are starting to engage in bad behavior, if their rhetoric is increasing, if they're starting to do things that are a little bit different than how they behaved before, we need to hear from you. We need to get that support from the private sector, from, like I said, our local communities, from the faith-based communities, from everyone. What we're dealing with now calls for a whole of government, a whole of community, just a holistic approach in order to solve it. Everyone has a role to play in this process. That's how important it is. And that's how significant the times in which we live are, is that everyone has to engage. Everyone has to be a participant in this process.
Joanna, one thing that's new about this is that people who have been arrested, many of them have been self-incriminating. They've been posting their own videos and saying, hey, look at me. Or as to what Voviette was saying, neighbors, friends, relatives have been turning them in too. So talk a little bit, please, about the profile of these people, who they generally are, and one of the more pernicious aspects, which is oath keepers, which is military, former military, police officials, ex-cops who have joined together and made common cause with this very seditious cause.
So ADL actually has some really good data to back up our understanding of those who are involved in the insurrection. In fact, actually, we've scoured footage and still photos, thousands upon thousands of hours of live streaming and various content to identify 212 alleged perpetrators of the insurrection. And the estimates are up to 800, so we still have a ways to go. But what we do is partner with law enforcement, with Voviette's counterparts in DC, to package up the footage and the images with the individuals we have identified. And you might be interested to note that 25% of those individuals that we identified are part of known right-wing extremist groups. This includes anti-government extremists like Oath Keepers or Three Percenters, white supremacists like Groypers and American First, conspiracy theorists like QAnon. And when we looked at where they come from, it's interesting that sadly, California is one of 5 states where over a third of the individuals came from those 5 states who appeared at the rally, from California, Texas, New York, Florida, and Pennsylvania. Those were the most represented states. And so what we're quickly learning as we see conspiracy charges come down the pike was that this was not necessarily just a spontaneous eruption of violence. There is some of that. There was a mob mentality that was at play, what we saw at the Capitol. But there was also signs, and ADL has identified and shared with law enforcement memos, an intelligence memo that identifies the plotting and the planning, the pre-mobilization stages that took place prior to January 6th. And overall, what we see is that right-wing extremists, whether or not it's the Trumpists or these anti-government extremists, QAnon adherents, white supremacists, they are united by their anger. And what we're seeing right now is the sense of grievance, the sense of loss, that something was taken away from them, that something was actually stolen. And with that, that can be a powerful mobilization to act. If you feel that the democracy no longer serves a purpose, that democracy is null and void and that is unconstitutional and being manipulated by all sorts of powers that be, that is a justification to take matters into your own hands. And so what we are careful to watch right now is the calls for bullets over ballots, the calls, the rhetorical rhetoric, the rhetoric that we're seeing across the virtual spaces. And we are going to spaces, encrypted channels and places that are not out in the, front and center, unfortunately, making it harder to uncover some of the ideology and activity and planning.
Roberta, we see the criminal prosecution of a lot of people going on, but what is the nature of the civil complaints here? Because it goes to the heart of whether or not this is a mechanism for stopping this. In California years ago, Tom Metzger, who was the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, his viewpoints were not really broken up, but the fact is that a civil lawsuit broke him financially, and that essentially put him out of business. So where do you see the impact of the kind of actions you are taking and how they work hand in glove with criminal prosecutions?
So as you noted, Pat, we definitely need both. There is criminal prosecution ongoing of the events of January 6th, and that's incredibly important. And criminal authorities like Voviette and her colleagues have a lot more power to do things than civil lawyers like I. And so it's very important that they do that. There were some criminal prosecutions in connection with Charlottesville, in my view, not enough. And that's why we got involved in bringing the civil case. But the theory behind the civil case is exactly what you said, that if you can make it clear to these groups and these individuals who do these acts, particularly the leaders, that if they do it, they will be sued. And if they are sued, there will be civil judgments against them. And then even if they can't pay those judgments, people will follow them around. Lawyers like my colleagues will follow them around, garnish their wages, put liens on their homes. We've already put Elliot Klein, we put in jail for 2 nights for his failure to produce documents. Many of the defendants in my case have huge fines already for failing to comply with discovery orders. That will have an impact, and it has. Many of them have complained. We follow them, as does the ADL, on the dark web, and we see what they're saying. And they complain about our lawsuit and about how it's inhibited their activities. Several of them have said they've changed. I don't know if they've really changed, but they're not engaging in that conduct because they're afraid of our lawsuits. And as I said earlier, very few of them, very few of them actually had the chutzpah to show up in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. So it's not as important as putting them in jail when you can. That's the most important thing you can do. But creating this sense of deterrence, 1, and 2, having a civil trial, which I hope will serve as a wake-up call. We already had a huge wake-up call on January 6th, but another wake-up call to the citizens of this country about what a threat this is will have an impact. Just today, Christopher Cantwell, the crying Nazi, for anyone who saw the Vice video, who has threatened to have a lot of fun with me when our trial is over, with me personally, was sentenced to another almost 2 years in jail. Those kinds of actions matter. It obviously matters to Chris Cantwell. It honestly matters to me because I will sleep easier for the next 2 years. But it matters in making it very clear to these people that this conduct is un-American, it's unacceptable, and we have the tools of this country under our laws and our Constitution to make it clear that it's not acceptable to behave like this in the United States of America.
Voviette, is it fair to look at prosecution of these offenses maybe in the same kind of broad field that the FBI, the federal government, used against racketeers, the mafia or criminals during Prohibition? Is it a unified field theory of prosecution where you go top to bottom from the bottom feeders, so to speak, to the leaders? And is jail time the kind that Roberta was referring to? It takes them out of service, but does it generate more interest? Does it create martyrs in the movement and make the movement somehow stronger in some perverse ways?
Well, you've asked a couple of things, and one, I think jail time, it does provide a deterrence. I really do. I believe that jail time provides deterrence, but the challenge we're up against is we are dealing with people that they are committed. They are somewhat what we refer to sometimes as true believers, where they believe this is their time, this is their moment, this is their revolution. And that is something we are up against. But the bottom line, Pat, is for the FBI, our mentality, our mantra is we're going to bring everything to bear to hold people accountable. Everything that is within our toolkit, all of the legal means of that we can bring to bear, that is what we are committed to doing, and that's what the American people want us to do, and that is what our charge is. So everything that we bring, when you talk about how we looked at organized crime, I think what you were referring to was the RICO infraction as far as racketeering. Here's the thing, if it makes sense, absolutely. If it makes sense, we are going to utilize everything within our means, all of the statutes that are available, and we're committed to thinking outside of the box along with our partners there from a prosecutorial side, from the Department of Justice and our U.S. Attorney's Office, that if it makes sense and if it fits that criteria, absolutely. We are looking at this from all angles, and we will bring whatever resources, whatever we can to bear in order to hold people accountable and to do the right thing.
Joanna, on the other end of the spectrum, we have people in this movement, most notably now Marjorie Taylor Greene, but in the past, Tom Metzger, David Duke, who have run for office, and Marjorie Taylor Greene's since she got elected. And this is a legitimizing, or at least putting into the mechanism of public democracy, this little seed of poison that they can therefore carry forward and say, look, we're the real deal. We're office holders. I'm a member of Congress as well. So how do you take on that question of using the mechanisms to destroy the mechanisms that you get inside democracy in order to undercut democracy? Because this is not going to be the last that we see of this.
I think extremists always use opportunities to take advantage of not only crises, but also how to access power and a base. And so we've seen historically, maybe we could relegate extremist ideology to the fringe. But as we are seeing more and more increasingly over time, is that they are coming, as their rhetoric is coming part of a kind of a larger rhetoric, a larger base of constituents. So whether or not it's David Duke, who really was one of those figures to promote this notion, don't just share your ideology with your affinity group, broadcast it out there. And they are retooling. So he was one of the forerunners in this. Don't use the N-word, don't use swastikas. Make your message palatable to others. And so we saw movements like the alt-right, like Richard Spencer, who said, don't talk about race, talk about Western civilization, talk about white identity. Because if you can sugarcoat your message, if you can make it more accessible to a larger base of people, you will grow your movement, not just from the fringe, but to the base. And the most egregious example of that is when those who have this fringe conspiracy actually gain access to power. Because really conspiracies are the lifeblood of extremist ideology. And each of those who have a bully pulpit, let's take last night, for example, Tucker Carlson. He used his hour-long platform to talk about and essentially deny the reality of QAnon. When you have Marjorie Greene talk about this laser beams being shot by the globalists from outer space, and they then can serve roles in our government, they can serve in positions where they can influence, that's really, really dangerous. And so one of the things I just want to mention is that ADL has this notion of a comprehensive 7-part plan to essentially mitigate threat posed by domestic extremists. And one of the core tenets of this plan, called Protect, is to ensure that those who have extremist ideology do not have access to power, are not sitting on key committees. They're not part of our military and they're not part of our law enforcement, and working at that in order to address it holistically. So this 7-part framework essentially not only uses ways that we can address domestic terrorism, like Voviette said, we want everything at our disposal in terms of our toolkit to respond to this problem. But we have to be very careful that we don't trample on civil liberties. And we need to approach this in the reforms that we are putting into place with a measured response as well.
So I'm going to take one question for a last round with you before we go to our audience questions. And we'll stick with Joanna on this, because how do you pull this out root and branch? How do you undo disinformation when we have so much confirmation bias that people are looking for things and interpreting things in ways or before you told them the truth in the first place? Where do you go with that? The deplatforming of places like Parler, they always find new homes. So what are your suggestions for getting to these causes beyond just prosecution and civil liabilities?
So we really need to take this whole of society approach, right? We can't legislate our way through this. We cannot arrest our way through this problem. And it is a multi-pronged approach. So whether or not through Protect, it identifies the responsibility and the onus of tech companies. Now, deplatforming is an imperfect solution, but we need to start somewhere. We need to push tech companies to have that transparency, to make their platforms more responsible, to engage in that virtual hygiene. Because what that does is that does decentralize the voice. It does send extremists basically scattered into this virtual diaspora. And when you basically take away the opportunity for them to access that message readily and go down that rabbit hole, you mitigate some of the access for those who may stumble across it. We need to educate. We need to work with our next generation. And it always sounds cliche, but that is absolutely the long-term strategy. We need to implement ways in which we can have our next generation address and kind of navigate diversity. We also need to and create inclusive school environments. And I would say we also need to create a Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. We have to be able to identify the problem, track the problem, and appropriately fund the problem. Because right now, there is a disconnect between what is actually happening in our national landscape and the type of funding that we are using in order to resource that threat.
Roberta, from what you've seen with the people that you are going after in court, what would work with them? What would get them to give up these ideas and this sense of grievance? When I encounter people like this, I say, what's changed in your life? What don't you have now that you had 4 years ago or 8 years ago or 10 years ago? And there's rarely an answer. So how do you address this amorphous sense of grievance and the anger that's putting people out on the streets about it?
So there have been some truly legitimate examples of people involved in this movement, again, mostly men, who have changed, who have legitimately changed and legitimately done teshuva, to use a Hebrew term, and repented, and are very active working with groups like the ADL and others and trying to convince others, people, especially other young people who may be attracted to this, that it's a very wrong path to go down. I think all the things that Joanna said are important. education, civics in our schools, just teaching the basic values that have held this country together and that have welcomed Jews to this country in the diaspora like no other country. It's important to reteach those values that our grandparents and our parents learned in school. And then again, I'm just a nuts and bolts lawyer. And so for me, I think there's a huge value into making it clear to people that if you do this, there will be consequences. And whether those consequences are jail time or whether those consequences are huge civil judgments, they tend to have an impact on people. And Richard Spencer, who Joanna mentioned, again, has complained, is really doing very little today on this, is not speaking, is not active, was not active at all on January 6th. And there's one reason for that. And the reason for that is our lawsuit. So we have to be doing a lot more of that. And we have to be just making it clear, both legally and culturally, that this kind of conduct is unacceptable. And I'm very grateful to the group Integrity First for America, who, working together with the ADL, helps keep us safe in our case, which is no small task.
Voviette, since 9/11, our allies in particular in Britain and France have been working to stop the radicalization of people in their country. What does the FBI see as its role, its mission, and what it practically can do to cut this off at the roots, the kind of extremism, the white supremacist groups that we're seeing now? Where does that go from your point of view?
I think for us, the bottom line is it is our number one priority. International terrorism, domestic terrorism, combating the terrorism threat that exists in the United States from the domestic front and from the international front. That is our number one priority. That is literally what the FBI is focused on and dedicated to every day, 365 days of the year of working towards. And so we are putting the full strength of our department into combating this threat. And the challenge that we have is that it is constantly evolving and it is changing daily. And that's something that we try to fight on a daily basis, is we have to keep up. We have alluded to the fact that basically terrorism is moving at the speed of social media. That's the reality in which we live in, unfortunately, today. And again, that's both domestic and international terrorism. So that is our charge, is that we have to keep up. We have to investigate these matters and we have to hold people accountable. It is very simple from our perspective as far as what our mandate is, what our role in this fight is, and what we are committed to. It is very simple, and that is something that we work towards on a daily basis, and we will continue to until it is eradicated.
Voviette, Barbara wants to know where these people get their money. And of course, funding of terrorism is always a way to look at the kind of blockchain of terrorism. So where is the money coming from? Is that something that the FBI can look at as well?
No, terrorism financing, it comes from everywhere. It's across the board. It comes from individuals, individual contributions. It comes from illegal gotten gain as far as money laundering through businesses. It comes from overseas. It comes from every source that is out there and available. It's no different. But the money, to the person's question, it's alive and well, and that's terrorism is being financed by individuals, by businesses. And I hate to say it is big business as far as that goes, but there is not a lack of money for these causes.
Roberta, where are your defendants getting their money?
Yeah, so in Charlottesville, there's no question that they had money. They drove around the streets of Charlottesville in these white Mercedes vans that someone paid for. They all had tiki torches on Friday night, August 11th, that they had paid for. They were all wearing the same white polo shirt and khaki pants. And they stayed in hotels throughout the Charlottesville area. There's no question they had funding. Unfortunately, most of their funding, as far as we can tell, was in Bitcoin. One of the advantages or disadvantages, depending on how you look at it, at Bitcoin is that it makes it impossible to trace. Or very difficult to trace. I think maybe Voviette and her colleagues can, but civil lawyers like I cannot really do that. I would strongly suspect that the same people who were funding January 6th were probably, or at least some of them, were probably involved in funding Charlottesville as well. But that is something we are still very much working on trying to find out. And it is a big problem because they saw coming to Charlottesville, as they did on January 6th, as a big party where they were going to have all this funding and we're going to celebrate this hate through violence.
Joanna, a couple of people have asked about threats from the left, and we hear a lot about false equivalency, and even Senator Ron Johnson saying, no, it was really Antifa, it was people dressed up as Trump supporters, not Trump supporters, not these organizations themselves. So can you address that?
Absolutely. There is kind of a knee-jerk reaction to both sides this issue, right? And I think what's so critical is to go down to the basics of the data. What does the data show us? And so ADL has actually, data drives policy. It helps us understand the landscape. It's not just anecdotal, but it's something that we can measure. And so what we found, we've been collecting since 1970s, is an understanding of murder and extremism in the US by domestic extremist groups. And in 2019, we saw 90% of all domestic extremist related murders were at the hands of right-wing extremists. And in 2020, that went up 4% to 94%, where right-wing extremists were responsible for the majority of the murders in the US. And an overwhelmingly a large percentage of that was tied to white supremacists. This year was the first time since we've been keeping that tabulation where we saw the murder of another individual by a self-described member of Antifa. The first time in decades upon decades. And so while there is concerns of some of the tactics used by the most extreme within the movement of Antifa, it's a movement, it's not a group. Wearing black and wearing a mask does not make you a member of Antifa. So we have to kind of understand and really refine our description and articulation of who is actually perpetrating the acts of violence. But certainly anybody who is using violence in order to carry out an ideology is something that we should condemn, and we wholeheartedly condemn. But when we're looking at the threats, when we're looking at those involved in each of these situations, in murders, in attacks, in plots, it is overwhelmingly from the right.
We can go a little bit after 6 o'clock for our questions as we have a lot of them coming in. Voviette, Jan wants to know about the scenarios that keep you up at night.
Well, unfortunately, that's a long list. I don't sleep much, Jen. That's for sure. It's a long list, and unfortunately, I say that seriously. Well, the conversation we're talking about today is something that keeps me up at night. The events of January 6th, I think it changed us forever, and it was a moment in our history. And the ramifications of it keeps me up at night because it tells me we have a lot of work to do. We still have a lot of work to do, and that's concerning. But there's so much that keeps me up at night. I can't be any more specific. I mean, some of the things that we talked about early on, we talked about some of the racism issues. Some of our civil rights matters keep me up at night. We have a lot going on in our civil rights arena these days. We have a lot going on just all over as far as counterintelligence. That's not a topic for today, but our counterintelligence program, the threat from China, that keeps me up at night. There's a long list. Unfortunately, we're living in very interesting times right now, and it's tenuous at best. But I appreciate that. I'd like to get more sleep, to be very candid. But we have a lot of work ahead of us, and that's why we have to stay steadfast. We have to keep our eyes on the prize, our eyes on the ball, and continue this effort to keep our community safe.
Roberta, what kind of legislation do you think would be useful without infringing on civil rights? That's the knife edge balance that we're trying to achieve here, to keep this under control.
Yeah, so look, one thing that makes our country great is the Constitution, obviously, and the Bill of Rights. And the First Amendment is the First Amendment for a reason. It's very important to have freedom of speech and freedom of religion in our country. But there's a big difference between the ability to say and think hateful things and the ability to act basically on those hateful beliefs by committing and planning violence. And it's when people cross that line that it becomes illegal. And the government, just like it did after 9/11, has to have the powers and the abilities to understand what groups who are doing this kind of conspiratorial planning of violence are doing. They were very successful after 9/11 in infiltrating jihadist groups and keeping us all safe. I'm quite confident that the FBI and Department of Justice is fully capable of doing that with these groups as well, but it needs to have some of the same tools that it had. And just because someone who's capable of committing violence was born in Pittsburgh or Fresno or Toledo instead of Saudi Arabia or Yemen shouldn't change things. The government should have the same ability to infiltrate, to figure out what's happening, and to take legal action when necessary that it has against people who happen to be Islamic. I think we can all agree on that. And so there are laws that have been proposed that would give the FBI and Department of Justice greater powers in that field. And it should have those powers because this is the single greatest threat facing our national security today. There's no question about it. Department of Justice just said it. So is Department of Homeland Security. Let me add one thing to what Joanna said about Antifa, because people need to understand this. Ever since Charlottesville, a specific strategy of these groups is to, quote, blame it on Antifa. When you read their messages on Discord leading up to Charlottesville, they say over and over again that we are going to blame it on Antifa. We are going to commit violence, say it's self-defense, and blame it on Antifa. If you look at the Black Lives Matter protests that happened over the summer, all those people wearing black, some of them were from right-wing groups breaking windows and breaking stores so they could then blame it on Antifa. So I agree. I'm not saying there isn't something as Antifa. There is a loose group that calls itself Antifa. But right now in the United States of America, they're not the ones who are shooting people in synagogues, who are shooting people in churches, and who killed policemen at the capital of our country.
Joanna, there's the paradox again, that after 9/11, the entire Congress, virtually the entire Congress, was on board with legislation, with tools, with funding to combat this. I have a suspicion that that would not happen now. So what can be done, given the limitations and the parameters where we started this conversation, of people in positions of authority, elected officials, who are resisting doing anything about this very dire threat that Roberta just laid out? Can you unmute yourself? There we go.
One would have thought that with the impeachment trial, we would have gotten bipartisan support. This was an act of domestic terrorism that was carried out in our nation. And the fact that there were not enough votes to be able to achieve that is something that gives us a moment of pause. Are we able in the future, in a bipartisan way, really call things out for what they are, or are we going to double down into our spheres of party lines and not rightfully address this problem? So it's incumbent on us to kind of reach across the aisle, to partner with those with divergent views in order to address this. Because frankly, what happened at the Capitol, the symbol of our nation, is something that nobody wants to have repeated. And so we have to be able to figure out ways that we can address this issue, to identify the threat of these groups, and to be able to fully understand the landscape. ADL has a heat map, for example, hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, and terrorism, and helping both the governments, politicians, and leaders understand that landscape. Understand, if you zoom into California, or if you zoom out to the western part of our nation, you can understand the threats that we're faced with real data of how many shootouts, how many plots and attacks, how many murders, quantifiable elements. This is one way forward, but this is a long road ahead for sure.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions of Voviette. One question is about the role of the prison population, if there's a Venn diagram overlap in fomenting extremist activity. And then the other one is, we mentioned it in passing about military involvement, law enforcement involvement in these groups, and whether because of their affiliations, the FBI has a special ability to look at that aspect of it.
Well, when you talk about the law enforcement or military engagement, it exists. And what we have to understand, and that's why this threat is so unique, is that it's everybody is involved. Everyone. Let me back up a minute. I think what would make people be more comfortable is if they could put a picture to who is in the extremist category. And that is part of the biggest challenge, is that there is no profile, is that it's a little bit of everybody. It's a little bit of your next door neighbor. It's a little bit of your family members. It's a little bit of your coworkers and colleagues. There is no one profile that this fits. We don't have that luxury. And unfortunately, law enforcement, military, everything's just a microcosm of society. And so, yes, there are military law enforcement individuals that have gotten involved in this arena, which is very unfortunate. And everyone has to be held accountable. But that's the challenge with this threat. Is that it touches every background and every type of person. Going to the second part of your question, when you talk about the prison population, it's one of those things where I don't know exactly what the question was asking about the prison population, but it's a population that cannot be forgotten, in the sense that a lot happens behind prison walls. And there
are a lot of white supremacist gangs and gangs in prison.
Yes, that is legitimate, and that exists. And we are aware of that, and we are actively engaged in that population also, as far as holding people accountable. But yes, that population, even though it is behind walls, yes, it is a population to be concerned with.
So
My last question for...
Let me just say one thing, because I want people to hear this, Pat. So every night I get a monitoring update from security people who monitor the dark web to see what people in these groups are saying about us. And I've learned not to read it just before I go to bed, because it doesn't speak for a very restful sleep. So I just got it literally as Voviette was just speaking. And a bunch of people on the web today were saying, quote, politically connected Jews like Roberta Kaplan and the Anti-Defamation League two people on this panel, specifically asked Judge Paul Barbadaro, he's the judge who sentenced Chris Cantwell to another 2 years of jail, to do it as a personal favor to them. This kind of stuff is out there daily. For people who don't believe this is a threat, take my word for it. Every single hour of every single day, these people are on the web saying these things. They were using Telegram, which is one of the websites that will accept almost anyone saying almost anything on it. Sorry for that interruption.
No, in fact, I'm going to use that to wrap up with, because we have a lot of questions and we don't have a lot of time, but this is not the last time we're going to hear this subject discussed in this forum. And I just thank you all, Voviette Morgan, Roberta Kaplan, and Joanna Mendelson. And there will be information going out with links and data about your organizations and your work to everybody who signed up tonight. So I'll give it back to David and to Janice to wrap up and talk about what it is that's coming up. So thank you all, and thank you to David and Janice.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We're really grateful for you having been with us tonight. It was a very disturbing and illuminating conversation, and we were really blessed with each of your amazing expertise, and more importantly, with the work that you all do day in and day out to make us safer. And it must be very difficult to go through each day doing that, but we really appreciate it. We're sorry for the echoing we had tonight. But we did the best we could, and we don't have a professional sound technician on any of our fronts, so I think we've done pretty well. So thank you so much from David and from me and from all of our co-sponsors. See you all next week, 5 o'clock Wednesday night. Foreign Policy with Michael McFall and Max Boots. Good night.